Hi, it's Dale. Welcome to our course video for this week. This week we're going to be talking a bit about post-colonial theory, and you had a chapter to read in your book called Judges and Method on post-colonial theory. And I just want to spend some time going over that because it's probably not quite like anything that you've encountered before unless you've done specific work in this area. And because it's new, just like to cover some of the basics. One thing I will say is give you a word of warning that this is a topic that seems to raise a lot of questions or issues with course participants that I've had over the years, simply because it may challenge the way that you look at power in the biblical text and how power is portrayed. So just be aware, keep an open mind. You don't have to agree with me, but think about sort of how your worldview has looked at these particular issues when you've been addressing the Bible. So just keep an open mind. Again, you don't have to agree, but here we go. So what is post-colonial criticism? Well, first of all, it exposes the ways that biblical scholarship and interpretation has been, over the course of time, dominated by people of white European descent, who overall have had little experience of oppression compared to many, many other groups in the world. So biblical scholarship has been dominated by Germans, Europeans, people like me, old white guys from the United States. And what has happened is there haven't been a lot of voices until recently, and I would say there are still not a lot of voices from other parts of the world. So we know that the way we read is affected by our own background. So when you shut out or exclude people that are from South America, that are African American, that are African, that are Asian, that in essence reduces the richness of kind of the world of interpretation of the Bible. So post-colonial theory wants to look at sort of how those voices have been excluded and what those voices might say now if they are given a voice to speak. Also, post-colonialism considers the situation of colonized or oppressed people in the present world, particularly those who are in a post-colonial situation. So in the 19th century, a lot of European powers dominated places like Africa and the Middle East and India. And eventually, those European powers and that imperialism collapsed. But in some ways, the people that were colonialized still, you might say, even today, experience that oppression. So if you think of the experience of slavery here in the United States, or the slaughter of indigenous people here in the United States, or places like Australia, it's not that all of those things are past necessarily. They still reverberate in our present situation today. So what post-colonial theory tries to do is look at the situation of these people and think about how this might help us read the Bible. So why does this help us with the Bible? Well, first of all, because the Israelites were a people that experienced a lot of foreign domination over periods of time. So I posted a really short 2 or 3 minute video that shows you all of the peoples that have invaded this particular part of the world over the last several thousand years. And it's a lot. So the fact that the Israelites were constantly being subjected to, battles with, nearby neighbors, faraway neighbors, so Babylon, the Akkadian Empire, the Assyrians, that affects how they lived and how they thought. So maybe if we look at people that have experienced something similar now today, we might be able to understand more about the Israelite situation. So one thing that comes up in our reading for this week, and the idea of imperial power, and which plays into post-colonial theory, is the sense of kingship. And kingship is a complicated topic in the Bible, and maybe one that you haven't thought about. But it does appear for the first time in our reading for this week. Several of the villagers want Gideon to consider himself as a ruler over them, and that they're going to give him this position. They don't exactly call it kingship, but they're kind of alluding to that. And they want his sons to reign after him. So, and this theme will continue on in the book of Judges. So it's popping up, so we need to talk about it, and that's why we're talking about it this week. So here, again, is where we need to be, IMO, in my opinion, extremely careful of our own biases. Now, we may think we live in a democracy in the United States, and we're really not all that, concerned about royalty and all of that. That's not really part of us. But I'm sure you all know that recently there was a royal wedding. Now, this royal wedding didn't involve really anybody even in line for the throne. But still, 30 million people in the United States got up at some crazy hour in the morning to watch that wedding. Now, what is that about? Why are we so enticed, enamored with royalty, kind of all of the trappings of royalty, the wealth and the power and the privilege that comes with us? It's a very attractive thing. So if you kind of fall into the group of people that are attracted by that sort of thing, then you need to be careful about how you may view kings in the Bible. So kingship and hereditary power is an extremely sort of alluring thing in our culture. We also need to kind of consider our attitudes toward the Israelites in general. So one thing that I find in many classes that I teach is that sometimes we tend to look down on the Israelites in some way. So here you have this ancient people, and they have come to you with this text wherein, as we've discussed, they basically say, here's how we screwed up. We made a major mess of ourselves, and we're confessing that to you. So we talked about earlier how most cultures don't do that. Most cultures try to build themselves up and tell you how great they are and tell you how great their leaders are. So the Israelites are really unique in this regard. In fact, sometimes when people get a little too critical in their textbooks in U.S. history, everybody goes crazy because, we don't want to, tear down the United States. That just doesn't really look good. So sometimes I think we look at the Israelites and they come to us and they say, we really messed up, and we tend to say, yeah, you really messed up. And I think part of that comes from, I don't know, maybe a little bit of our own guilt. Maybe we think that, well, I don't worship Baal, I don't do all of the things that the Israelites did, so maybe I'm not so bad, look how bad they were. So there's plenty of ways that, we participate in all sorts of sin and evil in the world. So, I think we should be careful if we get too much on our high horse about the Israelites or their violence or things like that, when we also live in a plenty violent world, at least in my opinion. We may not be committing violence ourselves, but our society commits a lot of violence in our own name. So let's talk about specifically how kingship is viewed in the Deuteronomistic history. So here I've used DH, and again, the Deuteronomistic history we've talked about is Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So for this group of books in the Deuteronomistic history, Moses is the idealized leader, prophet, and judge and military commander. So they just don't get any better than Moses. As I've mentioned in Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist says, there was never a prophet like Moses before or after. He's the greatest there ever will be. So here's where it gets a little tougher. Israelite kingship is not the will of Yahweh, but is instead, I would argue, a concession, and we'll talk about how that is the case, that eventually leads to Israel's destruction. Earlier in the quarter, we talked about where the Israelites' experience in conquering the land didn't turn out the way that it was first presented by God, how they lost trust in God when the spies came to the land of Canaan, and so God said, okay, you could have done it the easy way, but now it's going to be messy. So I would view Israelite kingship in much the same way, in that Yahweh does not will Israel to have a king, but sort of looks at it as inevitable because they're surrounded by people that have kings, and eventually they'll want one. When the guy across the street has something, it's natural that you might want it, and that eventually this will lead to Israel's destruction. So let's get into some of the details. And sorry, this is such a long passage, but I think it's extremely important for us to understand this. So this is in the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses is speaking, and speaking on behalf of Yahweh. And it says, when you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. So I want to be, the Israelites will say, we want to be just like everyone else. We don't want to be special. We want to be like everyone else. And he says, you may indeed set you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. So, okay, go ahead. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of all the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes. So basically Yahweh says, okay, Israel, I know I don't want you to do this. I know you're going to do this. So when you do this, here are the rules. This is kind of like, I don't know, parents turning the car keys over to their kids and saying, I know you're going to do something I don't want you to do, but if you go ahead and do it, here's what you need to be careful about. So that's I would say, the gist of this law. And then ultimately, in Deuteronomy, Israel's fate is foretold. It says, the Lord will bring you and the king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your ancestors have known, where you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. So ultimately, you people, you Israelites, and this king that you want so darn bad, they're ultimately all going to go into exile. And that's just kind of going to be the road for Israel. So we go on in the story and we get to the book of Samuel. And so that's after Judges. And sure enough, as Yahweh through Moses has predicted, the Israelites do indeed want a king. So this is from 1 Samuel 8, 5-9. And the Israelites said to Samuel, you are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us, like the other nations. So again, that key word, we want to be like everyone else. We don't want to have our own unique identity. We're tired of being the chosen people. Give us a king. But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So this is a pretty strong statement that Yahweh basically says, this is the Israelites rejecting me, rejecting my rule. They were never meant to have a king. They were meant to have prophetic leadership like Moses. So Moses is the model. These kings are not the model. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of the land of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So Yahweh says, yeah, what else is new? So also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel reported all the ways of the Lord, words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. So give them the warning, then do what they want to do. So what's the warning? Samuel said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will take for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50, and some to plow his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. So there you have it. Kings take what they want. If you consider these effects in light of what we've read from Myers, you know that most Israelites, particularly in this period of time, are living in a very tenuous agricultural situation. So if you're just barely raising enough food for yourself to eat, what happens when part of your food is taken away? What happens when members of your family are taken away? When the daughter that you plan to marry off to the clan across the street and get a nice dowry for ends up being acquired by the king. That's a loss to your family. What happens when your sons are taken away from you to go work in the army and work for the king? So those are all losses for ordinary people. And ultimately, kings enslave people. So just a quick review of the law of the king. So no foreign kings allowed. No acquisition of many horses. And if you get horses, no acquisition of horses from Egypt. No acquisition of many wives. No accumulation of wealth. Have a copy of the law made and read it every day. So those are the rules for Israel. So let's look at a king, Solomon, that you probably all are very familiar with and maybe think highly of. I don't know what your opinion of Solomon is, but let's look at how he stacks up against the rule of the king. So in 1 Kings, we read 1 Kings 4, Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. I don't know, sounds like a lot of horses. Later in 1 Kings 10, every one of them brought a present, objects of silver and gold, garments, weaponry, spices, and horses and mules. So, okay, maybe those are horses that were presents, but still, he's acquiring a lot of horses. 1 Kings 10, next verse, Solomon gathered together chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the kicker, 1 Kings 10:28, Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, which is a place further south. So I thought Solomon wasn't supposed, or any king was supposed to not go to Egypt to get horses. So this is specifically a violation of the law. And leaving horses beside, let's look at the issue of wives. So Solomon famously had lots of wives. So among Solomon's wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Exactly what the Deuteronomist said would happen. Was Solomon rich? Did he accumulate wealth? So you can find lots of instances about wealth in 1 Kings 10. The king made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. All Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Babylon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Like, who cares about silver? Silver is worthless. It was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. Notice that while Solomon accumulated great wealth, we don't hear anything about him sharing this great wealth with the rest of the Israelites. It's not like he decided, okay, everybody, we got all these great gifts, let's all share in the wealth of the land. It seems like the wealth was primarily concentrated in Solomon's household. Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. So forced labor is another nice word for free labor. So remember when Samuel says, you will be his slaves. That's exactly what happened. And when Solomon died and his son came to the throne, the elders of Israel said, you know, your father had this practice of forced labor for all of his building projects, and we hope that you will back down from that. And Solomon's son says, no, I'm not going to back down from that. In fact, it's going to be even more so, after which the entire country was split in half. There was essentially a civil war and a parting of the ways. And then ultimately, for Solomon, followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Solomon ends up worshiping foreign gods, just as the Deuteronomist said would happen. So clearly, Solomon does not know or follow the law. So we don't know whether he had the law written out for him, but if he's reading it every day, he isn't doing a very good job of following it. So the general problem with kings and imperialism in the Bible, and this is very, very typical. So kings steal, oppress, and enslave. They take what they want. Probably the two parade example stories of kings taking what they want in the Bible are David's taking Bathsheba and Ahab stealing Naboth's vineyard, which happens later on in the book of Kings, if you're not familiar with that story. But these are just cases where the king wanted something, he saw it, he took it, people got in the way, they were killed. Just that simple. Also, they rely on hereditary power, and this is an issue also noted in the book of Judges that we'll talk a little bit more about next week. Now, thinking about the model of Moses here again as prophetic leadership, and even the model of leadership in the book of Judges, this idea of Yahweh-inspired or Spirit-led leadership just sort of lands on the people that God chooses. So when Moses dies, his sons don't take over. In fact, it's a common theme or trope in the Old Testament is that if the father is good, the sons are typically not very good. So this happens with Samuel. We just read that passage where, Samuel was this great prophet, but the sons, no good. kings always want to maintain hereditary power. So no matter who the sons are, good or bad, they get to be the next in line. They strive to expand their empires by oppressing other peoples to enrich themselves. That's fairly obvious. They employ brutal means to stay in power. So the paradigmatic bad king in the Bible is Pharaoh. So anytime you see somebody acting Pharaoh-ish, they are acting like a bad king acts. So think about how Pharaoh tried to stay in power. He decided that someone was going to threaten his power, so he slaughtered all the baby Israelite boys and basically worked to destroy Israelite culture. If you understand the role of a male-led patriarchal society, destroying the boys means basically the society is going to disintegrate. So a very brutal means to stay in power. And King Herod, way later in the New Testament, copies the same thing. He knows what's going to work. So kings bring eventual misery and destruction upon their own people. So it isn't just foreigners that kings oppress. Ultimately, their oppression comes back to bite the king's own people. So think about the Exodus story and the story of the plagues. So you might say that, well, maybe why did the plagues affect kind of your average, everyday Egyptian farmer? Somebody that's not even in power, probably knows nothing about the Israelites and their own slavery. Well, yes, it's not fair. But this oppression brought about by the king sadly comes back to haunt the people that had no direct involvement in the oppression itself. So oppression brings not only judgment upon the king, but judgment on everyone else, innocent or guilty in the country. So as one person posted, I think a couple weeks ago, sin just makes a mess. So things get very, very messy and very violent when people are oppressed and enslaved. That's what happens. We see that from our own country's history. So this is really nothing new. So when you encounter a king in the text, Pharaoh, Eglon, and Herod, see if and how they oppress. So if you think of Ehud's assassination of Eglon, if that was something that sort of horrified you, think of how desperate the Israelite people must have been at that time. Think about how desperate the Israelites were when they were being oppressed by the Midianites. And we might get a sense of saying, well, maybe we don't agree with these tactics, but we can understand how and why this happened. Finally, we should also realize that sometimes the people that have traditionally been oppressed also become oppressors. And that is a sad reality in the post-colonial situation in our present world, and was sadly true for the Israelites as well. So the oppressed learn from their oppressors, and sometimes, and I don't want to say this always happens, but sometimes they eventually apply the same tactics, either on others in return, or even upon their own people. So the Israelites experienced oppression under Pharaoh in Egypt, and as we showed earlier, they turn around and later in their history develop the same sort of system. They want a king who is very Pharaoh-like, and sure enough, the king oppresses and even enslaves his own people. So another interesting aspect of the Uriah Kim article, or the section in the book that I had you read, talked about a little bit different idea about Israelite identity and who is an Israelite. So who or what is an Israelite? And that might seem like a very easy question. So you might think, well, Israelite is somebody descended from the sons of Jacob, and so it's sort of an ethnically answered question. Or you might say an Israelite are descendants of the people that received the law at Sinai. So that might be a little bit different idea about who an Israelite is. If you go back and read the book of Exodus, you'll find out that a lot of Egyptians left with the Israelites too, and were just sort of absorbed into the people. Moses' wife, or one of his wives, was an Egyptian woman, and this did not seem to present a problem to Moses. It presented a problem with some of the people that criticized him for that. So where exactly is this boundary? Is an Israelite somebody that follows the law? And if so, then there are a lot of people claiming to be Israelites that really weren't because they didn't follow the law. Or is it somehow an ethnic claim? Is Yael an Israelite? Is Rahab even more pointedly a woman who, in the book of Joshua, rescues the spies, and it says that she's basically welcomed as an Israelite in Israelite society. So in some parts of the Bible, the boundaries are very strict, and in other parts of the Bible, they seem a lot more pliable. And there's this dialogue almost back and forth between where this border lies exactly. So you can sort of see why the Israelites sometimes wanted strict boundaries. They didn't want to mix with the people that were around them. But then that always doesn't work either. So how does Israel maintain its identity? Even if you can define what an Israelite is, how is that identity maintained and continued into history? And again, I think the Deuteronomist would say, if he or the Deuteronomists were here today, I think they would say identity is maintained through teaching and following the law. Other Israelites may have had other ideas. So the Israelites were a people living among other people with different practices. So this is an interesting verse that I often bring up to talk about strict boundaries in Israelite culture. So an example in Deuteronomy 23:3 says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation." So even if you have Ammonite or Moabite blood, down to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So the assembly of the Lord is kind of a, I would say, symbolic phrase for who constitutes the actual group of Israelites, who are actual Israelites. And it also has connotations about worship, that if you're not an actual Israelite, you have no business worshiping with the Israelites, and ultimately down the road, no purpose or no reason to participate in temple worship. So the odd thing here, if you read the book of Ruth, you will find that that Ruth is a Moabite. So, and her descendant is King David. And it's not 10 generations later when David comes on the scene. So how is it that the law says no Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation, when David is not only clearly part of Israelite culture, but he ultimately doesn't build the temple himself, but he is very associated with worship in Jerusalem in many different ways. So how does this work exactly? And that is a question that I don't think we necessarily have a clear answer to. Does that make David a foreign king? Is he Are we to understand that he is a violator of the law of the king, that he was never really meant to be king? Are we on plan, not only on plan A, plan B, but plan C2 in terms of the rule of Israel? I don't know. Sometimes Yahweh seems to be very, I would say, flexible with Israel, patient maybe, and maybe things that are not or were never the ultimate plan turn out to be incorporated into Israel's history. So you can do with that what you will, but I just wanted to show you that this really is an interesting question about who really is an authentic Israelite. So those are good questions raised by Uriah Kim in our reading for this week. I hope that this discussion leads you to look at the idea of kings and kings more critically. I hope I didn't burst your bubble into pointing out that Solomon really wasn't a very good king. I could probably do a similar presentation in telling you that David actually really wasn't a very good king, at least in the book of Samuel. Here he had a lot of problems as well. But think about this issue of power, of how power is exercised over Israel, how Israel tries to exercise power over its neighbors, and what Israel tries to do to maintain its own identity. Thanks for your patience. Hope you're having a good week. Let me know if you have any questions.